I couldn't believe my eyes. I'd only been gone for a few months, yet the scenic view I cherished from my family's waterfront cabin had morphed into a chaotic construction site. Bulldozers churned up the soil, excavators groaned under the weight of gravel, and an imposing sign read, "Future home of 17 luxury villas, courtesy of the Crest Lake HOA." Right there, on my land, I felt a surge of disbelief so strong it made my head spin. This was my cabin, my late father's retreat, resting on a quiet lake in rural Washington state, an area rumored to be under strict ecological protections. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I simply couldn't fathom who had authorized such a blatant takeover. That's when I saw her, a tall woman in a pencil skirt and matching blazer barking orders into a walkie-talkie. My heart pounded as I stepped out of the car, wondering how on earth we'd arrived at this insane point. An HOA building an entire complex on property I'd owned for years. My name's Michael Reed. By profession, I'm an environmental regulator. Most folks in my hometown wouldn't guess I wield any real power. They see me as the mild-mannered kid who left town to work for the state's Department of Environmental Conservation, and for the past decade, I've quietly shut down illegal dumping sites, fought unscrupulous developers, and helped protect the wetlands from exploitation. None of that prepared me for the gut punch of seeing my own land swarming with construction crews. The sense of personal violation went beyond anything I'd experienced in my professional capacity. I stared at the half-finished villas cropping up around the lake, each with a sleek modern design that jarred against the rustic beauty of the forest. A swirl of anger and confusion tore through me like a raging current. This was no small shed or fence installation. It was an entire housing development. My father's beloved cabin was supposed to be my solace from the chaos of city life, a place to get lost in the quiet hush of pine trees and waterfowl. Yet the hush was replaced with the thunder of machinery. I made my way toward the tall woman with the walkie-talkie. I assumed she was in charge because the rest of the crew turned to her for instructions. As I approached, I caught fragments of her conversation. Something about Phase 2 landscaping, a mention of weekly fines for non-compliance, and the name, HOA President, Miss Meredith Lane. Her tone dripped with authority, the confidence of someone who believed they were firmly in the right. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my cool. "Excuse me," I said, forcing politeness. "What exactly is going on here?" She pivoted to face me, eyebrows arching in mild annoyance, as though I'd interrupted an important meeting. "And you are?" she demanded, scanning me from head to toe. I introduced myself briefly, stating that this was my property. She pursed her lips. "This land now falls under the Crest Lake Homeowners Association's newly acquired territory," she stated. "We have all the paperwork showing that the previous owners agreed to incorporate it into our development plan." My jaw tightened. There must be some kind of mistake. I never sold or signed over anything. My father and I have owned this cabin for decades. She shot me a thin, dismissive smile. "Well, our records show otherwise." That was the moment I realized I was dealing with someone who believed her own narrative without question. My entire body tensed. "Let me see these so-called records," I demanded, trying to keep my temper from boiling over. She shrugged, then lifted her walkie-talkie. "Robert, bring me the property files," she ordered. We stood in tense silence until a middle-aged man in a hard hat jogged over with a thick folder stuffed with official-looking forms. She flipped it open, showing me a deed that, on the surface, seemed legitimate. My family's parcel number was listed, but the name was slightly altered. The line that once listed Michael Reed now read M. Reed, Incorporated. The difference was slight but devastating. She tossed a second form at me, something about a rezoning ordinance that added the cabin's coordinates into the Crest Lake housing boundary. Every piece of paper bristled with official seals and signatures, none of which I recognized. I felt my stomach twist. I recognized a fiasco in the making. Fraudulent documentation, shady rezoning, and an HOA that wielded enough local influence to steamroll an unwitting landowner. That's when Ms. Lane dropped her real bombshell. "We sent notices for months," she insisted, eyes gleaming with faux concern. No one responded, so we proceeded under the assumption you forfeited your claim. Fury laced my voice as I snapped back. Forfeited? You can't just… She held up a hand. Sir, if you have an issue, you can file a complaint with the county clerk, but as of now, Crest Lake HOA has all the permits and approvals needed to continue. If you interfere, you'll be subject to legal action. Then she turned away without another word, leaving me standing there in the dust as construction equipment rumbled on. I realized I needed reinforcements. My first call was to my older sister Brooke, who had lived in the area longer than me and kept tabs on local happenings. She gasped when I told her the situation. That's outrageous. That cabin is in our name, she insisted. And you're absolutely sure Dad never sold it? I almost laughed, though it came out bitter. Of course not. He left it to me in the will. I've got the original deed. I took a shaky breath, a swirl of dread mixing with the anger. I told her I'd keep her posted, then hung up, my eyes drifting toward the newly bulldozed patch of earth near the water's edge. My father's canoe used to be propped against an old oak there. Now it was gone, replaced by stacks of lumber for some gaudy boat dock. The sense of personal loss cut deep, but I had to remain focused. There were more pressing problems at hand. I hopped back into my car and sped into the nearby town of Creekview. Though small and unassuming, the town housed the county offices where land records were kept. The clerk's office was a modest building, staffed by overworked civil servants who barely looked up when I walked in. An older woman at the counter eyed me warily as I approached with a stack of my own documents, including the cabin's original deed. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded politely and typed my information into her computer, wearing the polite but tired expression typical of government employees. After a few minutes, her brow furrowed. It says here the property was recently transferred to the Crest Lake HOA, she murmured, a hint of confusion in her tone. Effective 4 months ago. She squinted at my father's will, comparing it to the new records. This is definitely odd. The signatures don't match your father's from prior documents on file. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of frustration and relief. At least I wasn't imagining this. There was indeed a mismatch. Any chance these new documents are forged? I asked. She pressed her lips together. I'm not allowed to speculate, but we do occasionally see fraudulent filings. You'd need a lawyer, maybe a forensic document examiner to prove it. That last piece of advice stuck with me as I stepped back outside. My phone buzzed, another call from Brooke. She'd apparently contacted a friend who was a real estate attorney in Seattle. Send him everything, she urged. He's waiting for your email. Without hesitation, I scanned and sent copies of my father's will and the cabin deed to that attorney. My frustration burned, but a plan was forming in the back of my mind. If the HOA had stooped to forging papers to steal my land, they'd messed with the wrong person. That same day I drove back to the cabin site, determined to gather evidence of the environmental havoc these villas might be causing. My professional instincts flared. The lake was a sensitive habitat for salmon, and it fell under multiple protective regulations, federal and state. If the HOA was dredging the shoreline or altering the wetlands, they were likely violating a laundry list of environmental laws. For a moment, I wondered if Ms. Lane had any idea who I actually was. A regulator with the power to fine or even shut down entire projects. Probably not. Most of the time I worked behind a desk, rarely meeting with the general public unless a critical case demanded it. But this was personal, and I had the full weight of the law on my side if I played my cards right. Stepping onto the construction site, I was met with the acrid scent of diesel fumes and fresh sawdust. Workers scampered around, hammering frames and laying foundations for the villas that lined the water's edge. I took photos with my phone, the unprotected piles of dirt that could erode into the lake, the wide swath of cleared trees, the suspicious drainage pipe that seemed to pour runoff directly into the water. My chest tightened with alarm when I noticed a cluster of half-buried barrels near the shoreline, possibly chemicals for treating the wood or the soil. If those barrels leaked, the entire lake's ecosystem could be at risk. I silently fumed, remembering how Dad and I used to fish for trout here. Now, the fish would be choking on construction debris. Suddenly, Miss Lane's voice boomed behind me. "I hope you're not trespassing, Mr. Reed," she said, the emphasis on my name dripping with sarcasm. I turned to find her standing with her arms crossed, flanked by two burly security guards wearing the HOA's logo on their jackets. "Trespassing? On my own property?" I shot back, aware of how absurd that question sounded. She smirked. "Legally, this is Crest Lake HOA's development site. You're welcome to come by appointment, but otherwise I'll have to ask you to leave." Something inside me snapped. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to my credentials with the Department of Environmental Conservation, and held them up for her to see. "I'm also here under official capacity," I stated evenly. "I have reason to believe you're in violation of environmental regulations." Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The security guards exchanged looks. "We have all necessary permits from the county," Ms. Lane insisted, but her confidence sounded forced. I pivoted, pointing toward the shoreline. "Do your permits allow for direct runoff into the lake or burying barrels of potential contaminants? Because that's a major violation of state and federal statutes." For the briefest second, I saw real worry flash in her eyes before she forced her expression back into a mask of composure. "I'm sure everything is above board," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "We have top environmental consultants." I raised an eyebrow. "Then you won't mind if I take some samples and file an official inspection?" I thought her head might explode right there. She looked ready to protest, but one of the security guards cleared his throat nervously, as if hinting they shouldn't escalate. Finally, Ms. Lane ground her teeth. "Do what you must," she seethed. "But we both know this is about your misguided claim to this land. Please, don't waste your time." I wasted no time. I took soil and water samples, documenting everything meticulously. If the HOA truly had forged ownership documents, it wouldn't be shocking to discover they'd cut corners on environmental standards as well. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Brooks' attorney friend. He'd found glaring inconsistencies in the filed deed. Signatures didn't match, and the notary stamp appeared to belong to a notary who had retired years ago. This was exactly the evidence I needed to push back, but I also sensed I needed something more, an undeniable way to freeze their entire operation. That's where my job came in handy. If I discovered severe enough environmental damage, the department would have grounds to issue a stop work order. That would halt the entire project until a thorough investigation could be conducted. And if the HOA's finances depended on quick turnaround, a lengthy stoppage could cripple them. The question was whether Miss Lane had enough influence to override even that. I didn't know yet, but I was determined to find out. Later that evening, I dropped by a small pub in Creekview to meet with a local reporter named Travis Gordon, a wiry, bespectacled man who'd grown up around the area. Travis had a reputation for sniffing out corruption, whether at City Hall or at the local power plant. I laid out the situation for him, carefully choosing my words so as not to reveal confidential details. Travis sipped his beer and let out a low whistle. "A false deed, rezoning without proper hearings, potential environmental violations? That's quite a list," he muttered, jotting notes on a napkin. "Ms. Lane is new to the position, took over the Crest Lake HOA about a year ago. People around here say she's been unstoppable, merging smaller associations, pushing out older residents who can't keep up with her rules." He paused. "I even heard rumors she's got local officials in her pocket, maybe bribing them for quick permit approvals." My suspicions flared. If that was true, we were dealing with something bigger than a petty land dispute. "You think you can do a story on this?" I asked, leaning forward. Travis nodded. "You get me hard proof, I'll publish. The folks in this county deserve to know what's going on." We shook hands, an unspoken agreement forged to expose the truth. Over the next week, I juggled multiple tasks. First, I filed a formal complaint with the county, demanding an investigation into the fraudulent deed. Then, I requested an environmental inspection from the Department of Environmental Conservation, citing potential runoff contamination. Each day, I drove back to the cabin site, documenting the ongoing construction. Towering frames, heavy equipment inching dangerously close to the shoreline. In quiet moments, I recalled fishing with Dad, The lake's mirror-like surface at dawn, the gentle rustle of pine needles overhead. The thought that these precious memories were being desecrated fueled my determination. One afternoon, as I stood on the lake's edge collecting water samples, a voice behind me spoke. "Hey, you know you're not alone, right?" I turned to see a young construction worker, probably mid-20s, fidgeting with the straps on his tool belt. "Name's Ryan," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder as if checking that Ms. Lane wasn't watching. "I've seen some stuff around here that doesn't feel right." My pulse quickened. "Like what?" I asked. He hesitated, then pressed on. "They told us to dig a trench to bury chemical containers near the far side of the lake. Said it'd save money on disposal. Plus, we were rushed to cut down a bunch of old trees near the shoreline, no official arbor permit posted." He shook his head. "But you didn't hear it from me, okay? I need this job." My heart pounded with a fierce mix of gratitude and anger. "If you've got any documents or memos, they'd help me stop this," I told him. He pursed his lips, conflicted. "I'll see what I can do." Ryan's information was a gold mine. A few days later, he discreetly handed me a stack of papers, internal memos from the construction contractor, referencing Project Lakeside, urging the crew to expedite certain tasks before regulators catch wind. That phrase alone was incriminating, suggesting they knew what they were doing was illegal. I thanked him, promising to keep his name out of it. Equipped with this evidence, I forwarded copies to my supervisor at the department. To her credit, she sounded alarmed. "We'll dispatch a field team immediately," she assured me. "If they're burying chemicals, that's a serious felony offense under multiple environmental statutes." My sense of vindication flared. Ms. Lane thought she could manipulate local officials, but the federal environmental laws were a different beast. She was about to learn that ignoring them carried a steep price. During this stretch, Ms. Lane ramped up the pressure. My mother, who lived just a few hours away, started receiving strange notices claiming she owed the HOA fines for unpaid assessments. The mail threatened legal action if not paid promptly. My mother, rattled by the formal tone and the mention of lawyers, called me in tears. "This is nonsense," I growled, trying to calm her down. I realized Ms. Lane was lashing out, hoping to intimidate me into backing off. But it had the opposite effect. It fueled my resolve. I told my mother to ignore the letters and pass them to me for evidence. The more harassment Ms. Lane dished out, the easier it would be to prove malicious intent in court. One day, I arrived at the site to find Ms. Lane at the edge of the lake, shouting orders at a group of workers. She turned to glare at me. "Still lurking around, Mr. Reed? You sure you want to keep playing this game?" I locked eyes with her. "This isn't a game. You're violating multiple laws, and it's going to catch up to you." She gave a hollow laugh. "People in this county have tried to stop me before. They all failed. You might want to think carefully before you embarrass yourself." My fists clenched. "We'll see who gets embarrassed," I shot back, voice tight with anger. We stood there in a standoff, the hum of construction equipment echoing around us. Then, a moment later, a shrill whistle blew. The department's inspection team had just arrived. Climbing out of two official SUVs, they wore bright orange vests and carried clipboards. Ms. Lane's face went pale when she realized what was happening. It was glorious to watch. The inspectors fanned out, photographing disturbed soil near the shoreline, examining the suspicious trench that Ryan had mentioned, and measuring the water's pH levels. One inspector, a stern woman named Patrice, confronted Ms. Lane directly. "We've received credible reports of unauthorized chemical disposal," she announced, speaking with the authority of someone who'd shut down entire factories. "We need immediate access to all storage areas." Ms. Lane tried to protest, claiming they needed a warrant, but Patrice calmly cited the relevant environmental statute allowing emergency inspections when public waters might be in danger. Seething, Ms. Lane motioned for a supervisor to unlock a fenced-off storage area. The tension in the air was thick enough to slice. This was the first time I'd seen Ms. Lane truly rattled. She chewed the inside of her cheek, forced to stand aside as the inspectors combed through the site. Over the next couple of hours, the inspection team collected sample after sample. they taped off areas that appeared especially toxic. One of the younger inspectors came up to me, shaking his head. "We found half-hidden containers labeled with industrial chemicals. If the HOA lacks the proper disposal permits, this is huge. They could be looking at serious federal charges." Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with sorrow for the lake. I could practically hear my father's voice in my head. "You protect that lake, son. Keep it clean for the next generation." At least now, there was a real chance of halting the damage. By evening, Miss Lane's once confident expression had morphed into a mask of cold fury. She retreated to an on-site trailer, presumably to make frantic phone calls. I overheard snippets of conversation, something about pulling strings, shutting down the investigation, and tying them up in court. But she was dealing with a federal matter now. Local cronyism might carry weight with county clerks or commissioners, but it wouldn't stand up against an official environmental crackdown. As word spread of the investigation, folks in Creekview began whispering. Travis Gordon, the reporter, published an article titled "HOA Development Under Scrutiny for Fraud and Pollution." It detailed Ms. Lane's questionable tactics and included a photo of me standing next to the department's inspection vehicles. The piece caused a minor sensation. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts from old acquaintances, some offering support, others just wanting the inside scoop. A few brave souls even stepped forward to share their own experiences: threatened fines, unclear bylaws, abrupt land seizures. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Ms. Lane had built her little empire on intimidation and under-the-table deals. That weekend, Travis convinced me to hold a small community gathering at the local high school gym. The idea was to provide a platform for anyone affected by Crest Lake HOA's actions. I agreed, hoping to rally enough public outcry that local officials would have to stop ignoring the problem. On Friday night, the gym's folding chairs filled up with anxious residents, some from the immediate area around the lake, others from neighborhoods Ms. Lane had tried to annex. The atmosphere hummed with tension and possibility. People took turns at the microphone, recounting stories of receiving inflated fines, forced compliance with expensive aesthetic standards, and property lines mysteriously redrawn. I saw tears of frustration, angry fists pounding the podium, and trembling voices. These were honest, hard-working folks just trying to keep their homes. Ms. Lane's HOA apparently saw them as obstacles to a grand scheme of high-end developments and lucrative membership fees. I also shared my story, how the cabin my father left me had been snatched away on paper, how the shoreline was desecrated by questionable construction, how chemicals might now be poisoning the water. My voice quivered at the end, thinking of how Dad would react if he saw the lake in its current state. The crowd responded with supportive murmurs and applause. We formed an impromptu coalition, exchanging contact information and pledging to stand together. Travis, capturing it all on camera, gave me a thumbs up from across the room. That night, the sense of unity among the townspeople burned bright and defiant. Predictably, Ms. Lane found out about the gathering. 2 days later, a letter arrived at my sister's place, threatening legal action if I continued to incite false allegations against Crest Lake HOA. I read the letter with mild amusement. It seemed Ms. Lane was running out of moves. The environmental agency's official report wasn't yet finalized, but preliminary findings strongly suggested contamination of the lake. If the final report confirmed it, they'd slap the HOA with a cease and desist order, halting all construction indefinitely. The half-built villas would remain skeletons rotting on the lakeshore. My heart surged with a vindictive satisfaction. But I also remembered the prime directive: to preserve the environment. This wasn't just about payback. It was about protecting the lake for generations to come. As the days dragged on, tensions skyrocketed. Ms. Lane tried to hurry the completion of at least a few villas, presumably to secure partial sales and salvage the project's finances. Trucks roared in and out at all hours, and local rumor suggested she'd lobbied for some last-ditch rezoning measure. But the momentum was no longer in her favor. The department continued their investigative visits, each time leaving with damning evidence. Meanwhile, my attorney friend in Seattle compiled a robust case to invalidate the fraudulent deed. My father's original papers were as legitimate as the day they were signed, and it was obvious the new forms bore falsified signatures. The question wasn't if we'd win in court, it was how soon the judge would rule in our favor. Then, about 3 weeks into the fiasco, Ms. Lane took a desperate step. I arrived at the cabin to discover new no trespassing signs along the perimeter, accompanied by a tall chain-link fence blocking access to the main driveway. My father's cabin was effectively quarantined behind that fence, with HOA property signs plastered everywhere. Anger surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. Eagerly, I snapped photographs of this new intimidation tactic. Ms. Lane had no legal right to block me from my own property, especially given the disputed ownership. This was one more nail in her coffin. I called the local sheriff's office explaining the situation. They sounded hesitant, possibly because Ms. Lane had friends in high places, but I insisted on filing a report. The deputy who arrived later admitted quietly that his boss was reluctant to get involved. Politics, he muttered. Still, he wrote down my complaint. The very next day, Ms. Lane escalated further. She'd arranged a press conference on the site, presumably to spin her side of the story. I showed up, half out of morbid curiosity, half to present a counter-narrative if given the chance. She stood in front of one of the nearly completed villas, camera crews rolling, proclaiming that the development was a triumph for the community. Luxury housing that would elevate property values, create local jobs, and expand the tax base. When a reporter asked about the environmental violations, Ms. Lane blamed disgruntled individuals trying to smear our good name. She had the gall to suggest that my father had originally planned to sell the cabin but had never updated the official records. My blood boiled at the sheer brazenness. I clenched my fists at my sides, choosing to wait for the perfect moment. That moment arrived when a second reporter asked her to address the department's preliminary findings of chemical runoff. Ms. Lane brushed it off with a dismissive wave. "Nothing's been proven. We have the best environmental consultants on retainer." Unable to remain silent, I stepped forward and introduced myself as Michael Reed, owner of the disputed property and a state environmental regulator. A flicker of panic crossed Ms. Lane's face, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. In front of the cameras, I stated, "We have substantial evidence that this project is polluting the lake and that the HOA used fraudulent paperwork to seize my land. The department's final report is due any day now, and if it confirms what we suspect, this entire development could be declared illegal." The onlookers buzzed with excitement. Miss Lane tried to retort, but her eyes revealed genuine fear. She hastily ended the press conference, retreating into the villa with her entourage. True to my words, the department's final report landed just 1 week later, and it was devastating for Crest Lake HOA. The lab results indicated elevated levels of contaminants in the soil and water, traceable to chemical barrels found on site. The conclusion was blunt. The development violated multiple environmental statutes, recommended a cease and desist order, and urged immediate remediation of the shoreline. My heart soared, though I felt a stab of regret that the lake had suffered in the first place. Then came the legal bombshell. A judge in the county court reviewed our evidence of deed fraud. Within days, he issued a preliminary injunction invalidating the HOA's claim to my property. That meant the fence Miss Lane had erected had to come down, and construction on those 17 villas would be legally halted until the case was resolved. In practice, the project was dead in the water, literally and figuratively. Miss Lane's empire collapsed with shocking speed. Contractors walked off the site, citing breach of contract. Rumor had it that Miss Lane tried to sell off some of her personal assets to keep afloat, but the negative publicity scared off potential buyers. Meanwhile, local politicians who'd once courted her favor distanced themselves, feigning ignorance of her shady practices. The sheriff's office opened an investigation into possible bribery attempts, and the county commissioner who approved the suspicious rezoning resigned in disgrace. As for Ms. Lane, she faced a storm of lawsuits, from me, from local residents she'd harassed, and from state and federal agencies for the environmental damage. I can't say I felt sorry for her. She'd brought this on herself. On a crisp morning, the judge officially reinstated my rightful ownership of the cabin. I stood on the porch, taking in the half-finished villas scattered across the shoreline like remnants of an abandoned dream. Where Ms. Lane saw profit, I saw wounded land that would take years to heal. The department mandated an extensive cleanup, removing contaminated soil, replanting trees, restoring the fish habitat. A specialized crew arrived to excavate the buried chemical barrels, pack them onto trucks labeled hazardous waste, and haul them away for proper disposal. I supervised the cleanup with a heavy heart. My father used to say, "Nature's resilience is strong, but she needs a helping hand now and then." In that moment, I promised myself I'd do whatever it took to help the lake recover. Months passed. The skeletons of those luxury villas were either demolished or left to rot, depending on the legal entanglements of their respective financiers. The once deafening sound of machinery gave way to quiet afternoons filled with birdsong and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Occasionally a hawk circled overhead, as if reclaiming its domain. The local newspaper printed an editorial praising the joint efforts of the community, the environmental regulators, and one determined landowner who refused to be intimidated by corporate greed. My sister visited often, volunteering for reforestation projects around the lake. We planted saplings, sowed wildflower seeds, and coaxed the land back toward what it once was. Miss Lane, for her part, all but disappeared from public view. Rumors circulated that she'd fled the county, maybe even the state, to avoid facing the tidal wave of lawsuits. Some said she declared bankruptcy, her lavish lifestyle crumbling under legal debts and unpaid contractors. In the end, it was a cautionary tale. You can't just forge deeds, flout environmental laws, and bully an entire town without consequences. Perhaps she thought her network of allies made her invincible. She never counted on me being both the rightful owner and an environmental regulator who knew the system inside and out. She never imagined that the quiet fisherman's cabin by the lake would be the hill upon which her empire died. It took about a year before the lake showed real signs of recovery. Fish populations inched back as the water quality improved, grasses and reeds sprouted along the shoreline, stabilizing the soil. I'd often rise at dawn, walking the perimeter of the cabin grounds with a mug of coffee, marveling at nature's resilience. The old canoe Dad and I once used was gone. Someone had likely tossed it during the construction, but I purchased a new one, feeling a bittersweet mix of nostalgia and hope every time I paddled across the lake's glassy surface. Sometimes, in the hush of early morning, I caught glimpses of deer drinking at the water's edge. It felt like a small victory. I also made a point of staying involved in local politics. With Ms. Lane out of the picture, the Crest Lake HOA elected new leadership, more transparent and accountable folks who genuinely wanted to serve the existing community, not bulldoze it. The county implemented stricter oversight on rezoning requests and increased funding for environmental enforcement. Travis, the reporter, kept me updated on each small step toward reform. The memory of Ms. Lane's arrogance spurred us all to remain vigilant, determined not to let such corruption creep back in. One sunny afternoon, we organized a lake restoration festival. Families from nearby towns came to enjoy canoe rides, guided nature walks, and educational booths about conservation. I stood at a small podium, giving a talk on the importance of protecting natural habitats. It only takes one unscrupulous developer to erase what nature took centuries to build, I said, addressing a modest crowd gathered by the water. But it also only takes one determined community to stand together and fight back. My voice trembled slightly as I spoke those words, thinking of my dad's gentle spirit and how proud he'd be to see the lake healing. The festival concluded with a symbolic planting ceremony, a line of children each placing a sapling along the shoreline. I knelt beside a young girl struggling to pack soil around the roots of a tiny pine tree. She looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "Is this tree going to grow big and strong?" I smiled, feeling a surge of warmth at the simplicity of her question. "Yes," I told her, my voice full of conviction. "As long as we take care of it, it will." In that instant, I felt the weight of everything that had happened. Dad's legacy, Ms. Lane's betrayal, the massive cleanup, the legal battles, melt into a single point of clarity. Life moves forward, and the land can recover if given the chance. When all was said and done, my father's cabin stood once again as a peaceful refuge, a testament to the resilience of nature and the power of standing up for what's right. Stray beams and concrete slabs from the abandoned villas were hauled away, the ground was re-leveled and reseeded with native plants. The final legal verdict stripped Crest Lake HOA of any claim to my property, awarding damages for trespass and environmental harm. I funneled most of that money into local conservation efforts, scholarships for students studying environmental science, grants for replanting the forest, and improvements to public hiking trails. Sometimes, late at night, I gazed at the reflection of moonlight dancing on the lake. A year ago, I had discovered 17 luxury villas scarring this place, courtesy of an HOA that thought it was untouchable. Now, the only lights belonged to the stars overhead and the faint glow from the cabin's porch. The water was calm, and the echo of amphibians and insects told me nature was reclaiming her rightful space. It was more than a personal victory. It was a reaffirmation that, in the face of greed and corruption, justice could still be found. Whenever an old friend from out of town calls, asking if they can visit the infamous cabin, I chuckle and say sure. When they arrive, I watch their faces light up as they take in the pristine shoreline, the gentle hush of wind in the pines, the clear water teeming with returning fish. They often ask about Ms. Lane, about how she dared to build those villas. I shrug, offering a wry smile. She didn't realize who she was messing with, I'll say, and she definitely didn't realize the law isn't on the side of those who break it. If you're going to try to wreck an ecosystem for profit, at least make sure the rightful owner isn't a powerful environmental regulator. The punchline never gets old. The looks of astonishment never fade. And that's how the story ends, not with a whimper, but with a righteous roar of victory echoing across the lake. Ms. Lane's empire crumbled. My father's cabin remained stronger than ever, a sanctuary for wildlife and a beacon of hope for the community. In the end, the homeowners association that thought it could rewrite ownership documents and trample the environment learned the hard way. Sometimes, Mother Nature has powerful allies, and sometimes, even the biggest bullies are forced to back down. As for me, I walked away with a deeper appreciation for the land that raised me, a renewed sense of purpose in my work, and a quiet pride that Dad's legacy lived on in every ripple of that glistening lake. They tried to build 17 villas on my waterfront cabin. They ended up burying themselves in a mountain of legal trouble instead. And most satisfying of all, the place I love is finally safe, ensuring that for once the good guys came out on top.